I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I stand ankle deep in the marshy edge of Newfoundland, watching the first Viking boots sink softly into North American soil, a place they believed would rewrite their sagas forever, only to vanish under moss and myth. A wooden hull scraping gravel, the hiss of salted wind against fur cloaks. Somewhere a Norseman's breath fogs up the dawn as he wonders what hides behind the tree line. What did they expect to find? What did they fear would find them first? This was no pillage raid. This was a fragile hope for a new outpost at the far end of the world. If you find half-forgotten voyages and quiet ruins oddly comforting, maybe slide a like and subscribe my way. Just think of it as leaving a little runestone behind for the next wanderer. If you're drifting near sleep, already tell me which abandoned place would you spend a night in if you could. Now settle closer to your pillow, pull the wool blankets up to your chin, and let's follow those footprints ashore. Crunch of pebbles under calloused feet. The first shapes they built weren't grand longhouses, but rough turf shelters, smoke curling through holes patched with driftwood and dreams. They'd sailed west on word of Leif Erikson's promise. Vinland, the wine land where wild grapes and soft winters teased of settlement, not just raids. Historians still debate exactly where those first posts were hammered, though most nod toward Lanceau Meadows, a name that sounds more like a quaint farm than a place that once bristled with iron tools and nervous warriors. They weren't an army, but a handful of stubborn dreamers standing on borrowed sand. By day, they explored tide pools and forest edges, testing berries, chewing bark, searching for stone fit to strike iron. By night, they leaned over tiny fires, telling tales of the Greenland ice behind them and the rumor of endless forests ahead. Some say a child was born here first, to feel cold Atlantic mist from a cradle made of pine slats. Some scholars argue whether he survived the first winter or whether he was carried back across the whale road to a saga that would never mention him again. One forgotten footprint at a time, the Norse pressed into a land that refused to be tamed quickly. Ravens perched on crooked poles watching foreign bearded men haul driftwood and seal meat. The same birds would watch the camp decay posts topple iron rust. But for a brief bracing moment, the edges of Europe and America touched just long enough to leave behind an echo half buried beneath centuries of moss and coastal wind. Salt air still clings to your cloak as you wander deeper inland past where the first boot prints fade into the underbrush. Vinland Wineland was the promise that carried these rough-handed sailors this far west, and now that promise glimmers under low gray clouds and clumps of wild grapes no one expected to find in such a northern cold. At first glance, this place must have felt like a miracle. The sagas tell of mild winters and vines heavy with fruit. Some say Leif Erikson named it himself, plucking a cluster of sweet grapes under an autumn sun that felt softer than Greenland's sharp glare. Others insist Vinland was wishful thinking, a clever story to coax more settlers to gamble their lives on another plank and sail gamble. Researchers continue to debate whether the grapes were true wine grapes at all, or just a trick of hungry eyes and long journeys. You brush your hand over rough bark, tracing the outline of what would become makeshift huts. The Norse built quickly here, low timber walls, turf roofs, small gaps to vent fish smoke, and the thick smell of seal oil lamps. Nights were longer than they liked, but compared to Greenland's stone and snow, this land must have seemed gentle, almost tame. Imagine the hush at dusk, a circle of rough benches, fur cloaks, draped over shoulders, someone strumming a lyre string to keep dark thoughts away. They dreamed out loud voices, muffled under the soft hiss of spruce needles. Vinland could be more than a camp, it could be a fresh start. A land where children wouldn't scrape frost from their eyebrows before breakfast. Where iron could be worked without ice forming in the forge. Where fish came easily, and grapes fermented into heady warmth when the days grew short. Historians still argue whether a true colony ever existed, or if it was always more of an outpost, seasonal cautious, a thin line between Norse ambition and the reality of this vast, unmapped coast. Some charred post holes hint at permanent dwellings. Others read the sparse debris, broken rivets, slag piles, charred bones, as signs of a place abandoned as easily as it was claimed. But for the men and women squatting around those fires, none of that mattered yet. They dreamed in the flicker of flames, turning driftwood logs into benches, stretching skins over frames to block the wind. By day, they ventured inland small groups, with axes and cautious steps, testing how far their fragile claim might reach before the forest pushed back. And when the wind turned raw, they wrapped themselves tighter in woven wool, pressed closer together, in the half-light of a new world that smelled less like conquest than cautious hope. It's easy now, centuries later, to see it as doomed from the first footprint. But for a time here, at the edge of known maps, Vinland's sweet promise tasted like a chance to cheat the cold, outlast the hunger, and write new lines in the sagas waiting back home. A pale sun slips through the branches as you step away from the smoky huts and follow faint trails deeper into the woods, where the forest once held its own secrets, and the Vikings soon realized they weren't alone. They called them Skraelings, a word half insult, half warning, describing the indigenous people they met among the trees. These neighbors appeared like ghosts at the clearing's edge, silent, at first curious eyes, following iron axes and woven cloaks that gleamed strange under the northern light. The sagas describe that first glimpse shapes moving between birch trunks, figures wrapped in furs and feathers watching the strangers build turf walls and mend sails. No one knows exactly where or when that first cautious greeting happened. Some scholars argue it was a chance encounter by a river bend. Others think it was near the open coast, where fish traps crisscrossed tidal shallows long before Norse boots stirred the sand. The truth hides behind bark and bone, behind languages the Norse never understood fully, and stories the Skraelings kept for themselves. Imagine the hush of that first meeting, waves shushing the shore behind them, gulls crying overhead, two peoples studying each other across a gap of sand and suspicion. The Vikings must have wondered what these figures knew about the land, where to find sweet berries, how to smoke fish to last the winter, which rivers ran with salmon, and which trails led only to snowdrifts and hunger. The Skraelings, for their part, must have eyed the bearded men's iron blades and wondered what such sharp edges would cost. One overlooked scrap of saga hints at early bartering red cloth for animal pelts, bronze trinkets for fresh-caught fish. Small trades, gestures of peace that drifted in the cold air like cautious birds. A Norseman might smile and nod, pressing a strip of wool into open palms. In return, a Skraeling hunter would gesture to a seal carcass or a bundle of cured hides. Mutual need can build a fragile bridge, long enough for a word or two, a smile, maybe a shared fire on a frostbitten morning. Yet under those exchanges ran currents of quiet tension. The Vikings brought iron where stone tools had shaped the world for centuries. They felled trees at a pace that startled the forest's old keepers. They hauled driftwood to build barricades no local clan needed. The Skraelings watched, counted the axes, noted the blades that caught the sun like flares in the mist. What started as a flicker of curiosity could easily flare into something harder, sharper. History is rarely gentle when new neighbors arrive uninvited. Some scholars believe that first winter held an uneasy truce, bartering here, wary silence there, two camps sleeping back to back under the same stars. Maybe a shared fish catch, maybe a child tugging at a Norseman's wool tunic, peering at the strange iron buckle at his belt. But behind every trade was a question. Neither side fully asked how many more would come. And when they did, would they ask permission again? Your footsteps crunch on pine needles as you drift along the same paths, listening to echoes of footsteps that once hesitated here, wondering how far goodwill could stretch before someone reached for a blade. In the soft hush of this forest clearing, you can almost feel the tension humming under moss and roots of fragile balance between curiosity and caution, hope and threat. Back then, both groups might have stood under the same drifting snow, each one certain they understood the other's thoughts. But a gift is only peaceful until it's misunderstood. A gesture of open palms can harden into a fist when winter runs long and supplies run thin. The forest remembers saplings grow where shields once leaned against tree trunks, and a wind through spruce needles carries whispers of the scraling's cautious eyes, forever watching the strangers who came from the sea and left stories behind in the soil. The clearing fills with the scent of traded goods and cautious glances. For a while, the Vikings and the Skrælings exchanged more than wary nods. Small gestures bridged the chasm of language and custom. A strip of dyed cloth, bright as spilled wine, passed from rough Norse hands to softer local palms. In return, pelts of river otter or seal changed owners slick with salt and promise. You drift among them, now tracing the fragile web spun by these gifts and tensions. A Norse youth, barely more than a boy, holds out a small iron knife, gleaming sharper than any chipped stone blade the Skrælings had known. The hunter who takes it weighs it like a sacred stone. Somewhere behind him, elders frown at this metal stranger, a tool, a weapon, a wedge that could open more than fish bellies. Historians still debate how much was truly understood in these quiet trades. Some scholars argue that the Vikings believed themselves generous kings of the coastline, handing out iron and cloth like royal favors. Others say they underestimated the quiet authority of the Skrælings, who held the map of the forests in their heads and knew every tide that shaped these shallow bays. Beneath each polite exchange lay unspoken questions: who owned the land beneath their feet? Who decided how many trees fell? How many fires burned? Night came quickly to Vinland's camps. By the flicker of oil lamps, Norse men and women whispered of home of green pastures in Iceland, white drifts in Greenland, and the sagas they'd weave if this gamble paid off. Outside the turf walls, Skræling families gathered in their own circles, murmuring about the iron knives that cut too deep the sails that appeared like clouds on the horizon. There's no scholarly consensus on how often these small encounters turned sour, but the sagas drop hints. Cryptic lines about arguments over trade insults wrapped in gestures no translator could mend. Picture a feast in the fog. Long slabs of driftwood become benches, seal meat sizzling over smoky fires. A Skræling youth crouches at the edge, eyes darting to the iron nails driven through a Viking's boot. Children pass pieces of dried fish, back and forth, tasting salt, and daring each other to touch the red cloth fluttering like a signal flag. Somewhere, under that low sky, laughter mixes with murmurs of suspicion. Gift-giving in Norse culture was an obligation, a chain that bound givers and receivers in mutual debt. But to the Skraelings, some scholars believe gifts held different weights, different meanings. A blade could be a token of friendship, or a claim, or a threat disguised in iron. A piece of wool could mean warmth, or a sign that more strangers would follow hungry for the land's hidden bounty. Tensions threaded through these quiet exchanges like burrs in fur. A Skraeling elder gestures toward a stand of cedar, miming its sacred value wood, not for felling, but for shaping canoes and shelters. A Norseman nods politely, axe resting across his shoulder. Did he understand the warning? Did he care? The sagas fall silent here, leaving only speculation and the soft crunch of woodcutters moving where they shouldn't. By day, the trading continued beads. For fish oil, iron nails. For furs, gossip for guesses about what lay beyond the next inlet. By night, the campfires smoked with stories no one wrote down. Some say alliances were made brief, flickering ties that thawed a winter or two. Some say the first misunderstandings grew like frost on a spear shaft, thin, at first easy to brush away, until one morning they woke to find the blade's edge sharper than any bargain could blunt. You stand among them, a ghost in the smoke, hearing the hush before the hush breaks. A trader's smile hides a clenched jaw. A hunter's outstretched hand shields a wary glance. Gifts pass back and forth, but trust moves slower, creeping along the frost-lined seams of old animal skins and new iron blades. Somewhere a raven caws from a cedar branch black wing, bright eye the only witness to what these gifts would cost when winter pressed its cold demands on both camps. For now, the fires burn, the fish sizzle, the knives gleam, and the soft fog hides the edge where friendship and friction blur into the same quiet dusk. Dawn drifts in like smoke through the cedar canopy, carrying the scent of salted fish and brine-soaked seal meat. You stand near the fire circles now, where the Vikings gather in furs, huddled against the chill, and the forest leans close, as if listening for secrets. Feasts in the fog. These were the brief moments when hunger paused and the restless cold waited outside the turf walls. Imagine a Norseman crouched by the flames, turning a seal haunch on a spit of driftwood. He wipes grease on his sleeve, staring into the rolling mist that curls through the camp like a ghost. Somewhere beyond that haze, he knows the Skraelings watch silent shadows between spruce trunks. They might join the feasting, might not. Gifts pass hands here too. Fresh-caught salmon swapped for iron hooks, carved beads tucked into the hands of children who whisper about men with axes and strange words. Historians remain split over whether these shared meals built trust or tension. One saga line mentions a gathering that ended in laughter toasts and promises under the northern lights. Another hints at a quiet insult lost in translation. One careless word, one mocking gesture, and the warmth of the fires cooled fast. Some scholars argue that these feasts were tests of patience, of territory, of how far generosity could stretch before suspicion swallowed it whole. You drift closer to the spit, warmth pricking your cheeks. A Norse woman ladles broth into rough wooden bowls, handing them to a circle of fur-wrapped men who toast each other in low, tired voices. A Skraeling elder sits apart, eyes half closed, listening more than speaking. Children chase each other between the low huts, squealing until a mother's hand quiets them with a hush sharp as an axe edge. Between bites of seal fat and salted fish, the Norse talk of Vinland's bounty timber, enough for ships' wild game, enough for stews that don't run dry by midwinter. One man brags of a grapevine he found near a creek bend, heavy with clusters sweeter than any back home. Another scoffs grapes won't feed you when the sea urchins vanish and the seal herd swims south. He flicks a fishbone into the fire, where it snaps and pops like distant thunder. There is no scholarly consensus on whether they truly believe they could stay forever. Some accounts read like daydreams, Vinland as an orchard under the northern sun, bursting with fruit and tame animals. Others reveal quiet desperation, settlers gnawing on dried cod and nursing wounds from splintered oars and rough winter storms. Around these fires, hope and doubt mix like driftwood smoke curling into the endless night. Every bite of fish, every sip of hot broth, every trade of meat for beads, each was a fragile promise that the cold could be kept outside the turf walls a little longer. But feasts end, fires die down, and the fog returns to swallow footprints before dawn can trace them. You follow a Norse youth carrying a bucket of fish scraps to the tree line. He tosses bones into the undergrowth, glancing side to side for the flicker of eyes, Skraelings, wolves, maybe both. Ravens swoop in after he leaves black wings flaring against the dawn. What scraps of secrets did they carry off tucked in their feathers? Historians still wonder whether these feasts were truly shared or simply watched, whether the Skraelings joined the circle or stayed hidden in the fog, learning the stranger's habits in the hush between tree trunks. Back at the fires, men wipe their mouths with sleeves, whispering about the next day's hunt. A soft joke here, a bark of laughter there. 3 jokes for every full belly, a quiet reminder that fear can be chased away by a well-timed story. Somewhere, a half-finished song drifts into the mist, verses about home, about mothers left behind, about sons who would never see the fjords again. The tune slips away before the last note is sung, swallowed by the fog that keeps secrets better than any shield wall. And so the feasts linger, smoke caught in cedar branches, grease spots on tunics, half-buried fish bones under soft moss. Ghosts of warmth in a land that would soon test every promise these shared meals tried to make. Mist clings low over the camp as you trace your fingers along the edge of a crude wooden fence, half-hearted defense half marker that says, "This patch is ours." The warmth of feasts fades quickly here. In its place creeps a hush, heavy with the weight of misunderstanding and sharpened steel. Silent conflicts begin not with shouted threats, but with sideways glances, words that fail to bridge the language gap, and small slights that spark larger storms under the northern stars. Picture a single blade, a Norse iron knife offered in trade, admired turned over in a Skraeling's calloused hand. Maybe it was a fair swap, maybe not. Some say it was borrowed and never returned. Others whisper that a boastful Norseman demanded too much in furs for too little in iron. No saga writes it plainly. Historians still argue whether this spark was real or just a cautionary tale. What's clear is that somewhere near the edge of this misty encampment, one disagreement tipped the balance. You stand near where that first scuffle might have happened, a clearing of trampled grass, birch bark, torn where someone stumbled back, voices rising into the cold dusk. There was no grand battle cry, no lines of shields crashing together like waves, just a tense word, a hand on a hilt, a sharp intake of breath, as 2 worlds realized they were far more different than any traded bead or fur pelt could fix. The next day, the camps grew quieter. Where once children ran between fires, now mothers called them closer. Skraeling scouts melted into the tree line unseen, but felt in every crack of a branch underfoot. Norse sentries sat awake longer at the edge of the huts, eyes fixed on shadows that flickered like ghosts between spruce trunks, A misplaced laugh could sound like mockery. An axe blade could glint like a threat. Researchers continue to debate just how serious these tensions became. One saga hints that a single stolen tool or insulted elder set off a series of silent withdrawals, Skraelings trading, less avoiding the feasts, melting back into the forest where the Vikings could not follow. Some say minor raids or skirmishes flared, arrows loosed from the dark. Others insist the Norse found themselves suddenly alone, their fragile alliance ghosting away into the pines. You wander through the hush, imagining nights when wind pushed branches against the turf walls sounding like footsteps. A Norse settler wakes fingers brushing the hilt of an axe, listening for whispers that never come. He rolls over, muttering to his companion about the blade that cost them more than fur and fish. It cost the quiet certainty that neighbors would stay friendly. By day, they tried to patch over cracks, more gifts, more trinkets, bright cloth, bronze pins, beads that caught the low sunlight. But the Skraelings were wary now. Where they once stepped into the clearing with baskets of smoked meat, they stayed back, gestures short and stiff. Trust so quick to spark under hungry bellies flickered low in the frost-bitten wind. Historians remain puzzled by the pace, how fast the mood shifted from cautious curiosity to cold distance. Some say it was inevitable. Strangers who fell trees too quickly, who hammered iron, where stone had always been enough, who assumed a patch of earth was theirs because they built a wall and said so. Others think a single hot-headed youth Skraeling or Norse drew a blade that spoke clearer than any translator could. And so, under the northern stars, the camp braced itself. Fires burned lower to hide the glow. Sentries whispered about footprints found too close to the huts. Tools were gathered inside at dusk, no more iron left, lying around to tempt misunderstandings. A bowstring might hum in the dark, or it might just be the wind. A raven might caw from a branch, or it might be a scout slipping past, counting the number of boats pulled up on the gravel shore. In the end, no grand battle broke these early dreams, just a slow, steady silence growing wider than any river between two cautious peoples. You stand where the hush settled deepest, feeling the cold seep through your boots into the same soil that once held both promise and the first soft echoes of retreat. You drift now to the shoreline where the water laps quietly against the hulls of longships resting like sleeping beasts. The same boats that carried dreamers to Vinland's soft promise now stand ready to spirit them away again, oar-benched lifelines waiting for orders spoken in low voices around dying fires. Retreat to the longships was never written in the plan. These men crossed the whale road to claim new lands, not to scuttle back like raiders turned timid by whispers in the woods. Yet here they are, some sharpening oars instead of axes, others counting barrels of dried fish and seal fat that will barely carry them home. Along the pebble shore, footprints weave between boats, half patched, and sails half mended. The same hands that felled trees now brace hulls against the tide, hammering rivets, while glancing over their shoulders at the dark forest beyond the camp's edge. Historians still argue what tipped the balance for these settlers turned sailors once more. Some point to sagas that mention bitter winds and harsher winters than the first hopeful stories promised. Others say it was not nature that drove them off, but the slow, cold certainty that the Skraelings would not bend to iron gifts and Norse songs. No single battle, just nights of uneasy silence broken by the snap of twigs where no Norseman stood. You picture a young Viking perched on the ship's gunnel wool cloak, pulled tight as he rubs a hand along the worn oar bench. Maybe he dreamed of new fields, grapevines curling around wooden frames, children playing at the water's edge, while iron nails found new work, far from Greenland's ice. Now he listens to the creak of leather lines and the slap of waves against the hull, wondering if any of that was ever more than fire smoke fantasy. By day, the ships become busy hives of preparation. Bundles of dried cod iron tools and carved trinkets meant for trade are now hastily packed as precious cargo insurance against hunger on the long passage home. Some men mutter about returning to Greenland or Iceland with little to show but rumors and regrets. Others cling to pride better to leave alive than to vanish beneath moss and silence. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these retreats were all at once or spread across seasons, small parties, slipping away under dawn's pale hush, leaving behind splintered huts and half-buried iron nails. Some accounts suggest a few boats stayed lifeboats for the stubborn or desperate who clung to Vinland's promise longer than reason allowed. You follow the path of footprints down the narrow beach, listening to the cold slap of oars tested in shallow tide pools. A raider's spirit is restless here. Some of these men had never swung a hammer to build before they swung a sword to take. But here, at the edge of the world, raids offered no prize, only trees too thick and neighbors too quiet to conquer. Soft jokes pass among them dry as driftwood. We came for wine, we leave with splinters. 3 chuckles echo down the line, half-hearted, but better than silence. Humor is a shield when iron won't serve. Some scholars puzzle over a few stray, finds a ship rivet, buried far inland, a single carved post, tucked beneath a collapsed turf wall. Did some men hide from retreat, choosing the forest's secrets over the ship's deck? Did they vanish into the woods, rather than face the shame of failed colonists? No saga says so clearly. The truth hums in the salt wind, lifting scraps of old rope and secrets that cling to the tide. You pause at the water's edge, waves curling around your boots. The longships stand ready, lean dark, their dragon heads staring seaward as if daring the horizon to promise something better. These oar-benched lifelines carried hope westward, and now prepare to drag it home again, salt-crusted and half-forgotten. Somewhere in the tree line, the Skraelings watch silent witnesses to an exit that no iron blade could prevent, only delay. Tonight, the tide creeps higher. The boats nudge the shore, bobbing like they too are eager to go restless for the open sea that cares nothing for feasts, knives, or fragile treaties sealed in fog. Not everyone leaned on the oars when the wind turned cold and the feast soured. Some stayed tucked away in coastal coves where spruce forests met rocky inlets, where the surf's hush drowned out the memory of home. You stand among them now, the hidden few who refused to retreat entirely when the longships pushed off from gravel beaches under gray dawns. These holdouts weren't raiders anymore. They became shadows beneath the canopy, quiet figures, patching turf roofs with moss-smoking fish over low fires no Skraeling scout could spot from a distance. Historians still argue over how many stayed behind when the main party left. Some claim entire families chose isolation over failure's shame, vanishing into coves too shallow for ships to find. Others insist only a handful lingered, stubborn souls who mistook wilderness for second chances. Imagine a rough shelter wedged between granite boulders, driftwood walls softened by pine boughs. A Norse woman kneels by a stone hearth, scraping fish scales into a clay pot, while a child with pale lashes gathers spruce cones for kindling. Each breath tastes of brine and wood smoke. In the hush of dawn, you might hear the soft splash of a dugout canoe, drifting past skraeling hunters, moving upriver, more curious than hostile, now that these strangers pose no threat of iron fences or felled groves. Some scholars believe these few learned to blend in. The skraelings knew the secret trails, the hidden streams, the old ways of coaxing warmth from cold soil and fish from icy shallows. In quiet coves, it's said the Norse traded axes for baskets, iron nails for dried berries. A fragile coexistence, unwritten, unspoken, and wholly outside the sagas that celebrate kings and conquests. At night, the fires flickered low to keep the wind's secrets at bay. A soft voice told half-remembered verses of Thor and Odin to children wrapped in furs too big for their shoulders. Somewhere deeper in the forest, skraeling elders murmured their own stories about pale ghosts living where cedar roots drank salt water, and the waves turned foreign voices into echoes. There's no scholarly consensus on how long these coastal holdouts endured. Some say a generation or two long enough for Norse words to soften into whispers in another tongue, for iron blades to dull and rust, while new tools took shape from bone and stone once more. Others argue these tales are just hopeful shadows, a wish that some thread of Vinland survived beneath the moss and fog. You move among the ghost huts, now your boots pressing into soil that once felt the tread of fur-wrapped feet, stepping out each dawn to mend fish traps or gather driftwood. Bits of charcoal shards of soapstone, an iron nail curled in frost, all that remains of dreams too small to make it back to Icelandic hearth fires. Picture a lone Norseman at the forest's edge, watching a skraeling family gut salmon on flat stones by a stream. He shifts his weight, wondering if this is the moment he crosses an invisible line. No longer raider, not quite settler, but something softer. A guest in someone else's story. Maybe he trades his last iron knife for smoked fish, a handful of berries, a place to sit near the fire when snow dusts the branches. Small bargains like these slip through sagas. They live instead in local legends, stories of tall men in sealskin boots, children with fair hair, and words twisted by coastal winds, stories that flicker like firelight through cedar boughs. Some researchers point to bone combs, bits of worked iron, the way certain coastal families tell of distant ancestors who came from the east across a cold sea. In the hush of this hidden cove, you sense the quiet bravery of those who stayed not as conquerors or kings, but as driftwood caught in an unfamiliar tide. They found a way to sink roots among cedar groves and rocky beaches woven into the land's memory long after the last sail vanished beyond the horizon. The wind hums through spruce needles overhead, whispering of stubbornness loss and small hopes wrapped in pine smoke and stories no parchment ever caught whole. Beneath your boots, the ground is soft with centuries of moss and peat-hiding scars that only patient hands and sharp trowels can uncover. Lost encampments, they're everywhere and nowhere, ghost outlines pressed into the soil where sagas once hinted at more than they told. You stand among them now, charred posts, splintered boards, rusted rivets, half buried under the green hush of a Newfoundland summer. To the untrained eye, it's just another patch of forest birch saplings pushing up through what used to be walls, cedar needles drifting across stones blackened by ancient hearths. But kneel closer, and the clues appear. A nail bent by a hammer, long lost, a piece of slag from a makeshift forge, a scatter of bones gnawed by animals and time. Archaeologists pick through this quiet evidence, like priests decoding a lost gospel, one fragment at a time. There's no scholarly consensus on how many Norse camps dot these coasts. Lonso Meadows remains the famous one, a tidy cluster of turf ruins fenced in by walkways and interpretive signs for summer tourists. But beyond its roped-off trails, the stories get murkier. Some researchers swear they've found other sites, burned pits on remote capes, iron fragments hidden in peat bogs, soapstone shards, where no native tools match their shape. Yet the evidence always slips sideways when the wind shifts. Was that nail dropped by a Viking or by a Basque fisherman centuries later? Did that charred beam belong to a Norse shelter or a more recent outpost built with old driftwood? You crouch near a half-buried post hole, fingers brushing the damp edge where wood once braced turf against winter gales. Imagine the smoke drifting up through a hole patched with seal hide, the hiss of fat dripping into flames as a family huddled close, hoping the cold couldn't find them inside. A fragment of bone, a pig maybe, or goat offers a soft clue livestock carried across the sea for a promise of permanence. Some historians argue this alone proves intent to plan to stay to plant roots deeper than a single season. Yet the forest reclaimed it all. The Skraelings moved through these abandoned clearings, the hush of spruce needles, whispering over iron scraps and broken rivets. Some stories linger that they avoided these places, believing spirits lingered, where the pale ghosts once boiled seal fat and hammered rivets into ship hulls far from home. Others say the abandoned posts simply faded into the landscape. Cedar trunks swallowed them whole roots, weaving through sagas until the stories sank beneath the moss. Picture an archaeologist on a misty dawn brush in hand wiping away centuries of peat to reveal a rivet no bigger than your thumb. It gleams dull silver in the gray light, one more puzzle piece in a mosaic of loss. He bags it carefully, tags it with neat handwriting, then moves to the next square of earth. There's no battle banner buried here, no hoard of gold to trumpet across headlines, only small hints that dreams once burned bright under these northern skies. Some researchers argue the Norse knew these sites might vanish. They built with turf and driftwood materials meant to yield back to the forest when the last fires died. Others think they never planned to hide. Circumstance did that for them when the longships left, and the coastal holdouts melted into tree lines and river mouths, leaving behind nail slag and whispered stories that no scribe bothered to ink onto calfskin. You stand brushing moss from your palm, staring down at the slight depression where a hall once stood. Men laughed here, children squabbled over scraps of dried fish, women stitched sails by the flicker of oil lamps. All of it gone except for the stubborn traces that keep surfacing when the wind strips back the topsoil or a curious local kicks at an odd stone and finds iron hidden underneath. Lost encampments, half forgotten, half imagined, and fully alive in the hush beneath your boots. You step softly now, feeling how thin the barrier is between today's moss and yesterday's dreams. Somewhere under your heel, another rivet waits for the patient brush of tomorrow's hands. Wind stirs the birch tops as you wander inland, tracing a line from the moss-choked hearths toward the deeper hush where legend and rumor tangle like roots beneath the pine needles. Mixed bloodlines. It's a question that drifts through local firesides, even now. A whisper that maybe, just maybe not, every Norse dream sailed home or vanished beneath rotting timber. Some children, the stories say, carried both sagas in their veins, one of fjords and iron, the other of cedar groves and seal hunts. It begins with half-forgotten scraps, fragments of tales told by elders when the nights run long and the wind howls against the longhouse walls. They speak of red-haired children glimpsed in spruce shadows, their skin pale under a sun that warmed generations of darker kin. Some stories call them ghosts in bear hides, spirits of the pale men who came traded, fought, and disappeared. Others lean closer to flesh and bone, grandmothers whispering of ancestors who taught strange words that never quite fit the tongue of the coast. Historians remain divided. Some scholars dismiss it all as fireside fancy, a way to weave distant wanderers into local identity, a thread tying Viking iron to birch bark canoes for the sheer poetry of it. But then, an archaeologist finds a bead, a comb, a rivet, where no Norse camp should have been far inland, along river trails mapped only by native traders. Some researchers point to DNA studies, tiny samples from scattered remains that hint at genetic threads drifting centuries apart, too thin to prove yet too tempting to ignore. Picture a boy of the forest hair lighter than his cousin's eyes, a stormy gray when others flash dark. He walks the game trails with his uncle's skins caribou with a stone blade, yet hums half a tune no one else knows. Maybe his mother tells him about a man from the salt shore, one who gave her an iron hook, and stories of gods who ride thunderclouds. Or maybe she says nothing, just hushes him when he asks why his hair glows like driftwood in sunlight. Mixed bloodlines, if they existed, never asked permission to be written in the sagas. Scribes in Iceland or Norway had no patience for children who grew up far from any king's hall, whose stories tangled with local spirits, rivers and winter hunts that owed nothing to longships and rune stones. Yet here in these forests, blood and memory mix like river currents, shaping legends that slip through academic nets again and again. You push aside a branch, stepping into a clearing, where once a dugout canoe scraped the muddy bank. Some say driftwood dugouts carried not just news or trinkets, but children, half Norse, half native, paddled down hidden creeks toward warmer coasts. They moved beyond reach of iron blades or fading turf huts, their descendants folding old secrets into new names. There is no scholarly consensus on how much truth flows beneath these stories. Some dismiss the pale ghosts in bear hides as nothing more than fanciful echoes of contact that barely left a footprint. Others gather oral histories, like breadcrumbs, hints of old iron passed down through hands that never forged it, songs that rhyme strangely with distant Norse verses, faint linguistic ripples that wash up where no longship ever did. In the hush of this clearing, you feel the hair on your neck lift as if someone might be watching a boy with a splash of copper in his braids, a girl tracing circles on birch bark with a scrap of soapstone handed down like a charm. Maybe they linger here, still tucked inside stories traded at dusk when the wind bends the cedar tops and the rivers carry secrets south. Beneath your boots, the moss is thick. Somewhere below, bones lie curled in soft earth bones that once moved through both worlds, neither fully Norse nor fully Skraeling, but a quiet answer to a question no scribe ever bothered to ask out loud. Mixed bloodlines, part legend, part hush, and fully woven into the wind that slips between tree trunks, carrying songs that never quite learned to pick a single shore. Salt spray mists your face as you drift from the mossy clearings back to the coast, where driftwood dugouts once glided along the edges of the Norse dream trade. Along the shoreline, they called it in quiet boasts that rarely made it into the grand sagas, but lived on in beads, scraps of iron, and whispered tales that skipped from cove to cove like stones on calm water. Picture it now, a narrow dugout carved from cedar by careful hands long before any iron axe touched these shores. A Skraeling paddler cloak, drawn tight against the wind, guides it through the brackish shallows. Tucked inside his bundle are gifts of the last quiet exchange, bits of iron scrap, a handful of beads strung in colors. No local clay could conjure a fragment of red wool so bright it might as well be a banner. Historians still debate whether these small trades were planned alliances or chance encounters, quiet, cautious commerce that carried Norse echoes far beyond where their turf huts rotted under spruce boughs. Each tide line told its own version. A Norse settler stands ankle-deep at the mouth of a river, waiting for the dugout to appear from the mist. He offers fishhooks iron nails, maybe a broken knife blade, reworked to fit a local handle. In return come furs smoked eels, baskets of berries, dried to survive the hard chill of a northern dusk. Some scholars argue that even after the main camps fell quiet, these coastal trades lingered threads of iron, and rumor spun between people who never cared much for sagas, but cared plenty for warmth and food. You walk the tide pools now, the crunch of barnacles underfoot, echoing how news might have spread one dugout gliding south to a distant village where the bead traded yesterday gleamed on a neck at tomorrow's feast. It was never empire or conquest, only the hush of barter, made softer by salt winds and the low calls of gulls overhead. No saga stone marks these exchanges. There's no great carved runestone praising the man who swapped a rusted axe head for a basket of smoked salmon. But these quiet trades left marks nonetheless, beads found far inland, where no Viking camp ever stood, bits of iron tucked in shell middens, alongside antler tools and chipped slate knives. Archaeologists trace these roots like threads on a half-finished loom, weaving possibilities that the sea carried iron deeper into the forests than any longship dared push. Picture a scraling trader, leaning on his paddle at dawn, drifting between sandbars, while seals pop curious heads through rolling waves. Maybe he hums a tune he heard once at the edge of a Norse campfire, rough syllables twisted into the cadence of his own tongue. Maybe he smiles at the memory of bright cloth flapping from a pole, a sign that strangers might bring something worth taking home. Historians still puzzle over whether these trade routes left true legacy, or only tiny ripples that faded with each generation. Some say the iron trinkets found in deep inland graves speak of stories bigger than the sagas admit ghost colonies that survived as rumors long after the longships pulled away from cold shores for the last time. Your boots leave damp prints on the sand as you follow the imagined path of a dugout slicing south. Maybe it carries more than beads and blades, perhaps stories too. Tales of pale men with shields like mirrors of fires that smoked fish the old way, but smelted iron in ways the forest had never known. And maybe tucked in the bottom of the canoe a quiet understanding that some dreams drift farther than maps allow, carried not by sails, but by people who paddle silent shorelines under the watch of cedar and gulls. The tide pushes in, covering your footprints. Somewhere beyond the breakers, waves roll toward distant coves, where Norse iron native cedar and driftwood dreams once met in the hush before dawn. No runestone will mark this trade route. Only beads in the earth, iron in a midden heap, and wind carrying stories that sound like surf, whispering secrets no saga ever dared to claim. The fog creeps low across the dunes as you stand where the tide once kissed wooden hulls and watch the last traces of the Norse fade into something softer than memory, fading into myth. It's here where salt wind rattles beach grass and spruce branches groan in the cold that Europe's grip loosened its fingers from Vinland's edge, and the locals wove new stories to patch over the quiet gaps left behind. Long after the last iron knife rusted under moss, the Skraelings told tales around winter fires, tales of pale ghosts wrapped in bear hides who came from the sea on dragon-headed ships. Some stories painted them as tricksters, stealing fish and felling sacred groves. Others cast them as spirits lost between worlds, wandering the woods in moonlight, whispering strange words no hunter understood. No saga inked these versions. No Norse scribe bent over calfskin bothered with rumors drifting between cedar boughs. Yet here, in the hush of wind and surf, you hear them echoes stitched into stories traded like beads. A hunter glimpses a figure at the river's bend, hair-pale eyes like fjord water. He calls to it, but it vanishes into the birch stand, leaving only footprints that melt when the sun climbs over the tree line. Some elders swore that to see a pale ghost was an omen. Good or bad, no one agreed, but enough to hush children when the fog rolled in thick as seal oil. Historians disagree, as they always do. Some say these myths bloomed from scraps of fact, fading iron relics, the odd nail or rivet plucked from riverbanks, a fragment of soapstone lamp where no native hearth should have used one. Others argue that the Norse vanished too swiftly for stories to stick. But the coastline hums differently. Driftwood creaks on the sand like old hulls returning with the tide. Gulls cry overhead like watchmen that never stopped guarding the shore. You trace your palm along a lichen-crusted boulder. Maybe once a Norse boy leaned here, peering into the dark tree line where a Skraeling family watched him back. Maybe they traded a fish for a cloth scrap, a glance for a word that never found its way home. Maybe when the ships left, they left bits of themselves, too woven into the hush between branches, soaked into the sandy soil under cedar roots. Some scholars chase these whispers inland, following faint trails of beads and iron where local legends cling tightest. An abandoned hearth here, a carved stick there, markers that slip between fact and folklore when the wind shifts. No rune stone will confirm it. No parchment will pin it down. What survives is softer, a tale told by an elder's hush, a lullaby, humming with words that came from far across the sea, half remembered under fur blankets when snow piled high against the lodge walls. Fading into myth, there's a grace in it. Not every dream needs stone walls or iron gates to last. Some drift better when they untether from fact sailing. Instead, through stories passed from grandmother to grandson, each telling polishing away edges until only the ghost remains. You stand in the swirl of salt wind and see it bare hides, moving through spruce shadows, pale shapes that watch but never speak, a reminder that Europe's hand reached this far, then let go. The Norse didn't build kingdoms here. They left no fortress, no grand burial mound, no rune stone under which future raiders swore oaths of conquest. Instead, they left scraps, rumors, and the soft footprints that moss drinks up so well. They left their echoes in the lull of surf, the hiss of cedar needles brushing together when the wind shifts east. And they left stories, slippery things that stick to the mind better than any nailed-down fact. Tonight, the fog thickens. You feel it wrap around your shoulders like a bear hide. Somewhere just beyond your reach, a pale ghost waits at the forest's edge. He says nothing. He carries no sword. He leaves you with a question whispered into salt wind: who really stayed and who truly vanished? Push past the hush of myths and stand now at the deck of another ship, a battered Greenlander Nar, creaking under rough hands and salty prayers. A forgotten return. Not the proud sails of Leif's first landing, but a quieter slip back toward a place half remembered and half-finished stories. This time, they didn't come for wine or warm winters. They came for timber and tusks, the old currency of harsh, ice-cracked homesteads, desperate for trade. You lean over the gunwale with them, sea spray stinging your cheeks as the coast creeps into view again. Pine silhouettes and tidal shallows that once cradled dreams of empire. The sagas hardly mention these later sails, but they came all the same. Greenlanders hunting lumber. Their frostbitten valleys couldn't grow prowling the coastline for walrus herds that slipped beneath the ice like rumors that never stayed put. Historians argue over when exactly these returns happened. Some claim small bands drifted west again within a generation, stubborn as driftwood refusing to rot. Others think these ventures spanned centuries, stray ships pushing into the Labrador cold, tracing old routes their grandfathers sailed, hunting the promise of profit rather than colonies that cost too much blood and salt. Picture a crew pulling ashore in a shallow cove. No grand hall rises to greet them, only old turf mounds, half swallowed by spruce roots, rusted nails scattered in sand, like teeth from a giant's jaw. They build quick shelters just enough to strip bark from logs and stack planks for the return trip. No feasts now. No cautious welcomes from neighbors in the woods. The Skraelings watch these rough men from a safe distance. Traders turn trespassers with little to offer but rust and loud axes. By night, the cold wraps around them. They huddle near driftwood fires, boots crusted in ice breath steaming against fur hoods. Some wonder about the ghosts, whether the old camps truly emptied, or if pale shapes still prowl the tree-lined shadows that speak in tongues the Greenlanders never learned to answer. A quiet superstition flickers between the crackle of burning branches. Better not to wander too far from the shore. Better not to test how deep the forest remembers. Some scholars point to ship rivets found far inland signs. They say that these later voyages sometimes stray deeper than they meant to. Did they barter with Skraelings, still telling stories of the first pale men? Did they find scraps of their kin's failures? Iron blades buried in moss soapstone lamps, cracked but still warm to the touch. The records don't say, and the wind on these shores never tells. You follow a crewman inland, boots crunching frozen earth, where spruce saplings claw through old turf. He swings an axe into a pine that groans in protest, a sound older than any saga. Chips fly the tree's scent sharp as it falls. Timber. That's all they want now. Timber for homes back where the ground cracks with ice, and warmth costs more than gold. Timber to build ships that might sail farther next time, maybe south, maybe west, again, maybe nowhere at all, if the ocean swallows their hope as it has so many before. At dawn, they drag logs to the shore, lash them to hulls patched so many times they creak like old bones. No flags flap from the masts, only battered sails salt-stained and half-mended from storms that almost claimed them twice already. The crew eats dried fish in silence, glancing at the forest edge where the Skraelings watch from shadows. No greetings, no trades, just an unspoken bargain. Take your trees and tusks, then go. Some researchers wonder if these final visits were the Norse's quiet confession that Vinland was never theirs to hold. They came for timber tusks trade and left the myths behind for others to pick through like bleached whale bones on a cold beach. You stand by the hull as they push off sails snapping in the cold breeze, the surf foaming around boots, lifted at the last second from the shallows. Another forgotten return, another brush with a coastline that never quite let itself be tamed. Behind you, the forest closes its hush around abandoned clearings and rusted nails. Ahead, the Nar dips into the gray chop carrying timber and secrets back across the whale road, leaving only faint ripples curling toward a land that never promised to keep any visitor for long. Kneel now in the hush, where the undergrowth softens every footprint, clues beneath the moss. This is where the last traces of Vinland sleep hidden under blankets of pine needles and centuries of forest breath. No saga pages flutter here, only the patient scratch of a trowel brushing away time grain by grain. It's modern hands that find what the old hands left behind, small betrayals of iron and soapstone that whisper of a dream that slipped through spruce roots and black soil. Picture an archaeologist at dawn, steam curling from a mug of weak coffee while he crouches over a shallow pit. The forest leans close. Every bird call feels like an interruption to the hush of what lies below. There, a soapstone spindle whirl a rivet no bigger than a child's thumb, its iron dark as old blood. Each fragment is a question with no clear answer. Some scholars argue these clues prove permanent homes. Others say they're the debris of seasonal raids or brief camps, iron marks on a coastline that never truly opened its arms. One finds a fire pit lined with stones blackened by grease and heat hidden under a layer of peat so thick it takes hours to scrape clear. The ashes inside cling to tiny bones, seal fish, maybe a scrap of pork fat, salted on a longship deck months before it burned in this clearing. Some say these scraps rewrite sagas. Others shrug one fire pit does not a colony make. There is no scholarly consensus on how to read these buried puzzles. Do they speak of failure or stubbornness, of settlers who hoped the whale road would stay behind them forever, or raiders who knew they'd leave before the snow found their boots? Each find cuts both ways. Proof of presence, proof of impermanence. You stand among flagged grid lines and shallow pits marked with stakes and string. Overhead, the spruce branches hiss in the wind, a sound that might be surf if you close your eyes. Below your boots, the earth cradles soapstone shards, soft as soap under the trowel's edge. Once they formed cooking pots, lamp bowls, smooth edges that warmed seal oil to push back the dark. Long after the flames died, the stone stayed behind, stubborn in the moss, waiting for modern hands to tug it free. Sometimes the clues spark local rumor into legend all over again. Villagers drift out to the dig sites, boots scuffing fresh moss, murmuring about red-haired ghosts who still whisper by the shore. Children peer over cordoned pits, eyes wide at the sight of iron older than any house they've ever slept in. Some ask if the Vikings might come back, if the ships might crest the waves again when the fog lifts. The archaeologists just smile, brush dirt from a rivet, and say nothing. Better to let the wind answer that. Researchers continue to debate if more camps lie waiting beyond the reach of backhoes and careful trowels. Some spend whole seasons combing marshy edges for scraps of slag and the ghost outlines of turf walls swallowed by centuries of spruce needles. For every new find, an iron nail here, a bit of bronze, there a dozen questions sprout like mushrooms in damp shade. In this hush beneath the moss, the Norse dream lingers in pieces too stubborn to rot iron rivets, where no local forge ever stood, a soapstone bowl shaped by Greenland hands, the faint echo of hammer strikes muffled by time. No grand hall remains, no fortress wall crumbles into the sea. Just these stubborn clues, quiet fingerprints pressed into soil that only yields them when it's good and ready. Tonight, you crouch beside the pit as dusk folds itself into the forest. The archaeologist packs his tools, tucks the rivet into a small cloth pouch, and stands. The forest swallows the echo of footsteps as quickly as it hides the next clue, deeper still, beneath the moss, waiting for the next patient seeker, and the next story half guessed from a scrap of iron no bigger than a pine cone. Stand now where the wind runs free, echoes on the wind, the last breath of a story too quiet to conquer, but too stubborn to die. Here, at Lance o' Meadows, or some nameless cove farther down the coast, the Atlantic hush carries Norse whispers no parchment ever fully pinned down. You feel it in the gusts that rattle spruce tops, in the salt tang that tugs at the edge of your sleeve as if to say, listen closer, there's more than you think. Picture this, a stray rivet under moss, a soapstone shard pressed into peaty soil, a single line in a saga that trails off with the ink. These are not the grand ruins of Rome or the stacked stones of Machu Picchu. These are echoes, small ones, the kind you catch only when the surf falls quiet and your breath slows enough to hear the old questions swirl through the mist. Some locals swear you can still feel them here, Leif's crew, the hidden holdouts, the ghost traders in bear hides. They say, on nights when the fog clings to the coves and the tide slides up the pebbled beaches, you might hear voices in the spruce half-words, in Old Norse or something close to it, caught between the branches and the sea. Historians shake their heads at this. Some claim it's just the wind, a trick of branches brushing together where sagas never reached. Others lean in closer, take soil samples, test old bones, sift the DNA for whispers that science can't quite hush. No scholarly consensus will pin it down, not fully. What the records didn't catch, the moss kept instead. It holds the footprints, the fires, the iron that rusted slower than the telling. Archaeologists find pieces gnawed over slag heaps and rivets and charred beams that match no local pattern. They send reports, publish papers that say yes, maybe, perhaps almost. But the wind keeps its secrets better than ink ever could. Imagine standing here at dawn, alone on the path where a Viking once dragged driftwood to patch a shelter. The surf hisses behind you. A raven croaks from a spruce branch, black wings glinting above where some half-forgotten camp gave up its last spark centuries ago. You might see it a flicker in the corner of your eye, the shape of a man in sealskins, a woman coaxing warmth from a low lamp, a child tracing runes on a driftwood plank with a stick too short to reach Iceland. Some stories claim they never left at all, that somewhere hidden among the coastal inlets and tangled spruce the bloodline lingers. Red-haired children with words that twist like river currents, bits of iron heirlooms buried in cedar chests nobody talks about. Other stories say the Skraelings wrapped the Norse into their own tales. Pale shadows drifting through the woods, neither threat nor friend, just an echo you learn to respect when the wind calls your name too sharply in the dusk. What survives now is softer than any carved rune, the hush in a clearing, the rough line of stones that might be a hearth if you believe hard enough, the faint crunch underfoot when you step on something that once held fire. There is no plaque for this, no guided tour in summer to tell you what to think. Just the salt wind and the moss that remembers more than paper ever will. So you stand here as the last drift of fog lifts off the cove, listening to those whispers coil through spruce needles and slide out to sea. The longships are gone, the settlers folded into legend, the Skraeling stories stretched over centuries like sealskin over a drum. But the echo hums on soft, half-true, fully alive, whenever the wind finds your ear at the edge of the known world. If you stand still long enough, You might catch it a breath of Norse on the Atlantic air, a promise that dreams, no matter how they vanish, always leave something behind to hum through the trees when no one's looking. And just when the echoes fade, a glint of iron catches the dawn proof that every ending drifts quietly toward another beginning, hidden in the hush of a single nail, rusting where waves meet stories. On some forgotten northern beach, centuries ago, a native craftsman kneels by washed-up driftwood. Among the salt-scarred branches lie strange shards, twisted iron nails, and tarnished copper rings, nothing like the bone or stone he knows. He runs a thumb over the cold metal, puzzled by how iron crossed a restless sea to land at his feet. Stories say these early finds came long before official maps ever pinned the Norse to these shores. Tiny clues that time traveled ahead of the scholars. If you like your bedtime stories a bit saltier than the usual lullaby tap, that like and subscribe button, I promise no raids tonight, just a gentle voyage through echoes. And if you're half awake under the covers, tell me, have you ever found something where it didn't belong? Now tuck your feet under the furs and drift back to that lonely shoreline where one odd nail hints at a long-lost handshake between worlds. You stand beside the craftsman as he flips the ring in his palm, not yet knowing that centuries later someone would argue if it was dropped by chance or carried by a carved prow breaching the dawn mist. Drift closer. The beach is empty, except for gulls and the hush of the tide. The craftsman pockets the iron and heads inland toward flickering fires and wary eyes. Nobody quite trusts this strange metal yet. The elders will squint at it, weigh it against bone and flint, and whisper about storms that spit out monsters and gifts alike. Some historians swear these artifacts prove contact long before Columbus ever dreamed of ships. Others say a storm could carry anything across an ocean wreckage rumor, a single sailor's hope gone rust red in salt air. Driftwood, drift iron. What matters is how these things find a home far from their forge. Tonight you feel the cold of that nail in your own palm. You follow the craftsman back to his people iron, clinking like a secret at his side. They will gather by the fire, poke at the metal, and wonder who hammered it first, what hands bent it into shape, and whether those hands will ever come knocking again. Somewhere in the dark wolves' circle, the wind smells of pine salt and an old story that's just begun to whisper itself through smoke rings and hush. And as the fire crackles, that nail battered and bent becomes more than salvage. It becomes a question you'll carry with you tonight as we slip deeper into these tangled trails left by drifting iron and drifting tales. A flicker of wind shifts the smoke as you step closer to the firelight. The craftsman's children peer at the odd ring he found on the shore, its tarnished curve reflecting the flames. In the hush between crackles, an elder clears his throat and murmurs a word the others haven't heard before. It doesn't sound like any tongue they speak. It rolls from his lips like distant thunder. New words, new tales. That's how they begin. Long before parchment and ink pinned down the past stories carried the weight of a people's memory. Here in these frost-bitten woods and fog-wrapped coasts, language drifted on the wind like seeds. A single word misplaced or borrowed could anchor itself in an elder's tale and survive longer than any tool or nail. You listen as he speaks again, this time repeating that strange syllable. It doesn't belong to this shore, and yet tonight it takes root. They say some tribes kept these odd words alive, hidden in lullabies, hunting chants, or whispered warnings by the fire. When the first curious traders or missionaries scribbled down phrases centuries later, they stumbled across hints verbs that bent like Norse nouns that tasted of the North Sea's salt. Scholars still argue whether these echoes prove real meetings or the simple tricks of language drifting across trade paths and rumors. A child repeats the elder's word, giggling as it catches in his throat. He tries again, slower this time, tasting the sound like smoke on his tongue. Around the circle, others pick it up, rolling the foreign shape through their mouths until it feels half familiar, half ghost. Somewhere across the ocean, another fire burns in a Viking hall, voices rumbling words that might match these borrowed syllables. Though none here can know if the tongues ever truly met face to face. You feel the warmth of the fire on your cheek as you watch these small sounds change hands. It's a fragile link, softer than iron, but harder to break. Some words die out when the last mouth forgets them, but others hide tucked into prayers, place names, or the secret hush of stories told to children, nodding off under fur blankets. One curious fact even today, a few scattered dialects across the north still clutch a word or two that puzzle linguists. Terms for iceboat or bear that bend oddly toward Norse roots. Some scholars remain puzzled by whether these slips are coincidence trade or whispered proof that Viking feet once pressed the same mossy paths you now tread. So you lean in closer. The elder gestures with the ring tracing a shape in the dirt. A boat, maybe, or a beast with curved horns. The children laugh, guessing animals they know: caribou, elk, seal. But the elder only nods, not correcting them. He understands that stories slip through time, like frost on a branch, never quite the same shape come spring. Now, the wind shifts again. Sparks swirl up into the night sky as the words pass from elder to child, from one tongue to another, ready to ride the breath of future storytellers. Each syllable is a seed drifting far beyond this fire, sprouting roots in places the craftsman's nail and ring will never reach. The metal rusts, the stories don't. Under the cold stars, you can almost hear both fires burning, one on this wild shore, another in some far-off Viking hall, where men toast each other in rough timber beams, never guessing that fragments of their boasts and blessings might wash up a world away. The night deepens. Someone throws more driftwood onto the flames, salt pops and sizzles in a small fireworks display. The children squeal their new word forgotten for now, but it sleeps in their minds. When they grow old, it will surface again, wrapped in a tale of iron nails, strange boats, and travelers who vanished into the fog. One word, one ring, one clue. That's how history drifts on. Earlier, you saw the craftsman turn metal in his palm. Now you watch his people turn a word over the same way. Turning it, weighing it, testing its shape against the world they know. They don't know. They're laying down clues for curious minds. Centuries later, minds like yours, squinting at an old rune or a stray syllable, wondering who spoke it first. Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl calls. The elder raises a hand, listens, then looks back at the children. He repeats the word, once more quiet this time, like a promise. And then the fire crackles, the ring cools, and the night presses close, holding the secret safe for another dawn. A hush settles over the camp as dawn crawls toward the treetops. Beyond the fire's circle, shadows linger where hunters once sharpened bone and chipped flint by hand. You find yourself standing among them now, ghosts with steady hands crafting arrowheads by the soft rasp of stone on stone. Tonight, though, your eyes drift to a different gleam iron, harder than bone, tougher than chipped rock iron tips that catch firelight in a way flint never could. Long before maps were pinned to parchment iron crossed the ocean's restless back in the bellies of carved wooden ships. Maybe it washed ashore with splintered planks. Maybe it came tucked in a trader's hidden satchel, swapped for hides or furs beneath the hush of northern pines. However it came, once it arrived, it stuck hard and sharp and stubborn. In your hands, tonight is one of those arrowheads, dark cold, etched by a craftsman who might never know the Norse word for forge, but who learned quick how iron bites deeper than bone. Some say these iron tips turned up far from any known Viking outpost, buried in hunting grounds, where only stone and bone should lie. Archaeologists pull them from the earth centuries later, brushed clean under museum lights. But here, in this hush of imagined night, you see them new, freshly hammered, from stray iron, fitted to an ash shaft, tied tight with sinew. A hunter stands beside you, weighing this strange point against the familiar trust of flint. Bone shatters on moose hide. Iron slides through. It's an upgrade any hunter would understand. There's no scholarly consensus on whether the Norse traded iron freely, or whether these tips arrived like drifting rumors, one stray nail here, a lost rivet there, repurposed by clever hands. Some believe small trading camps existed where metal passed from Viking trader to native hunter arrowhead by arrowhead. Others insist iron spread was accidental wreckage scraps the ocean's generosity. Maybe both stories hold a splinter of truth. You shift your feet on frost-hardened ground as the hunter tests the new arrow against a target, a battered tree, its bark scarred from countless shots. The iron tip thunks in deep, where bone would splinter. He nods, once satisfied. Beside him, another hunter carves away the last sliver of flint from his pouch, old tools replaced by something stronger. You feel that quiet revolution, the moment bone yields to iron, an invisible handshake between worlds. Years will pass, generations too. By then, the stories will fade, a rumor of a pale giant with hair like straw, a carved beast drifting out of the fog, a ring of iron nails found on a cold beach. But the arrowheads stay buried in the hunt's memory. A moose felled by a sharper point. A bear brought down with less wasted effort. These small victories echo louder than sagas in places where daily survival writes the only history worth remembering. The hunter wipes his hands, lifting the arrow to the dawn's shy light. He shows it to his son, who fingers the cold metal and wonders how many more he'll craft when his father's hands grow stiff. You wonder, too, how long iron will last once bone and flint are forgotten beneath the moss. Some say the iron vanished as quickly as it came lost to rust and time. Others claim iron-working traditions lingered hidden in the folds of native smithing lore, small forges, flickering in places scholars still debate. A bird calls overhead, its wings stirring the branches as if urging the hunters onward. The boy sets the arrow into his quiver, alongside bone tips, for now a quiet insurance policy against the old ways failing him. He doesn't know that centuries later, strangers will dig that arrowhead up and argue over its story in languages the boy could never dream. Earlier, you sat by the fire where new words caught like embers on children's tongues. Now you stand here in the morning hush, where cold iron weighs down a hunter's palm. Both are gifts left behind by strangers who vanished into fog and salt. Both speak when no tongue can. The hunter looks at you as if sensing your questions through the hush of centuries. He gives a small nod as if to say, it doesn't matter how it got here. What matters is what it can do now. The arrow finds its mark. The forest holds its breath. And somewhere beyond the trees, a carved longboat waits to drift once more, carrying stories sharper than flint, longer lasting than bone. Beyond the last ring of campfires where the forest thins and brackish mist rolls in from the sea, a story waits for you told in low voices and flickering sparks. It is here, among driftwood logs, arranged in a loose circle, that elders gather the young, close urging silence as the wind sighs through pine and spruce. Ship stories by firelight ghost tales, some say. But for the old ones, they are half memory, half warning. Tonight, you slip into the circle unseen. Sparks rise as an elder shifts closer to the flames, his shadow dancing on the hide wall behind him. He speaks slowly, his words a hush that pulls your heartbeat down to match the soft roll of waves on some distant shore. In his tale, there are beasts carved from wood, long and lean, with dragon heads, snarling at storms. They come from the edge of the world, sliding over gray water, like spirits you can hear, but never catch. In this flickering story, the ships appear just after the last salmon run, when mist thickens and the sea tastes of winter. Some swear they saw sails white as bones ghosting between the islands. Others claim they heard voices, deep booming laughs that clashed with the gulls' cries. But when the fog lifted, there was only empty water and driftwood scraping the pebbled shore. The ships never stayed long enough to leave a footprint, just a glimpse, a shout carried on salt wind, a carved prow slipping back into the deep. Historians still argue over these coastal tales. Some dismiss them as borrowed myths, retold from sailors' gossip and explorers' notes long after any real Viking prow dared these waters. Others dig for evidence in soil, salted by time scraps of timber iron nails, a fragment of woven sail buried beneath centuries of moss. They find hints, but the stories remain stronger than any artifact, harder to bury too. One elder's voice grows louder, echoing off the driftwood logs. He tells of the giant beasts painted bright with coiled serpents and strange eyes that watch the shore from far beyond the breakers. He claims his grandfather's grandfather saw such a beast when he was a boy, its carved jaw snapping at the surf as pale-haired men laughed and threw fish to barking dogs. A trade, maybe, or just a visit that turned to a ghost the moment the tide pulled away. You lean closer. The logs crack beneath your weight as you settle into the circle's warmth. Sparks drift upward like tiny ships themselves, bright fleeting swallowed by the night. Children's eyes go wide at the thought of dragons drifting where only canoes usually tread. They huddle nearer to parents' knees, but no one leaves. These tales are half fear, half lullaby, comforting in a way only whispered monsters can be. It's worth noting that coastal charts drawn centuries later sometimes marked odd wrecks, stray reports of strange timbers, rivets that matched no local craft. Scholars pore over these scribbles, weighing rumor against erosion. Some believe these ships did land briefly quietly, like dreams breaking against the shore before dawn. Others argue driftwood tells better lies than people do. You watch the elder's hand slice the air, mimicking a longboat's glide over crests and troughs. He pauses now and then to let the wind fill the gaps between words, letting the sea itself finish the tale in its own hush. The children lean in. Somewhere far off, a gull cries as if to agree. Earlier, you held iron in your palm, felt how it could change the hunt. Now, you sit at the edge of a campfire where stories hunt something softer, belief or doubt, or the thrill that maybe just Maybe you share blood with sea roamers who laughed into the mist. It's easy to see why these ship stories linger. A carved beast is easier to remember than a forgotten trade or a rusted nail. A longboat drifts deeper into the mind than any dusty record could. One child dares a question. Did they come back? The elder's smile is hidden by shadow, but his eyes flicker with sparks. He shrugs, lifts a handful of sand, and lets it fall through his fingers. Maybe they did, he says. Maybe they're still out there riding fog, hidden in the bones of the sea. The fire crackles. The story settles like ash on your skin. And somewhere beyond the trees, you swear you hear the faint creak of a prow, cutting through the hush gone when you listen too hard, but always waiting if you drift quiet enough to dream. The fire has burned low, leaving only a circle of embers that crackle like secrets in the cold night air. But you don't move from your place among the listeners. Not yet. Because where ship stories end, trade paths begin, and the embers still hold a glimmer of copper and beads. By dawn, traders slip away from the coast, paddling canoes heavy with furs and hopes. The path winds through dense forests, skirting lakes that mirror the sky. Somewhere deep inland, well beyond, where any longboat could float, curious beads appear, small glints of color, buried in places no Norse map ever marked. How did they get here? How does a strand of blue glass or a curl of twisted copper find a home hundreds of miles from salt air? Imagine you're a trader now, slipping between trees, so dense the sky turns green. In your pouch, you carry beads, bright cold, smoother than any stone you've ever napped. They come not from your hands, but from somewhere so distant it might as well be another world. Maybe you bartered them from a cousin of a cousin, whose uncle swore he met pale men with iron and carved beasts at the coast. Or maybe you found them tucked into a trade bundle slipped there like a whispered promise of connection. Some say these beads link distant shores, tiny stepping stones of commerce that crossed rivers, forests, and language barriers. The Norse traded beads by the boatload across Europe, amber glass copper, carried in carved boxes aboard ships built to slip through icy fjords. Historians still argue whether those same beads rode paddles inland in North America. Did a Viking trader stand on a forest edge, offering a handful to a wary local hunter? Or did the beads ride inland hand to hand, invisible cargo in an endless chain of trust? The evidence is as small as the beads themselves. Fragile clues sifted from burial mounds and village middens. A glass bead found hundreds of miles from the coast, a scrap of copper curled into a pendant where no local copper mine ever lay. Some scholars shrug it off. Coincidence later, trade European trinkets lost long after Viking sails rotted to ghost fabric. But others linger over these tiny specks of proof, hunting for a thin thread that might stitch two continents closer than the old textbooks claim. You watch a trader by his campfire rolling a bead between calloused fingers. It catches the glow a bright spot among dark pelts and bark baskets. Around him, others trade skins for food stories, for trust. But the bead is more than ornament. It's proof that somewhere far away, a stranger-shaped glass in a forge the trader will never see. A piece of the world that doesn't belong to the forest, yet finds a place here anyway. Earlier, you sat by the elder's fire as he spoke of ships, drifting like beasts through fog. Now you follow those ships in spirit, their ghost cargo scattering inland, long after the hulls return to salt and splinters. Beads and copper slip through canoes, woven into hair, stitched into cloaks, tucked into stories that will survive long after the last trader's paddle rots on a forgotten riverbank. Somewhere down the path, Another campfire flickers. A child there wears a strand of beads at her throat, bright blue against her fur-lined collar. She traces each bead with small fingers, not knowing they carry more than color. She doesn't care about forges or fjords, about Norse names or sagas she'll never hear. To her, the beads are magic, something beautiful, something rare. That's enough. In the hush between trading posts and hunting camps, these tiny tokens become bridges. They don't speak a word, but they link a carved longboat bobbing on salt water to a canoe slipping through marsh reeds. They remind you that history doesn't only ride on iron nails and loud legends, it can float on something small enough to slip through a child's fist. So, tonight, by the dying glow of the trader's fire, you hold a bead up to your eye. Light seeps through blue glass that has no business here. No local soil shaped it. No native forge gave it birth. Yet here it is, proof that people are rivers too, carrying stories, goods, and gossip far beyond the horizon line. The wind shifts. A trader packs up his furs and tucks the beads away. Somewhere, a forest owl calls. And once again, you feel that quiet pull, a reminder that small things drift further than great ships sometimes do. The path winds on. When the traders and their beads vanish into the trees, they leave behind more than bright glass. Sometimes they leave behind whole houses in places that puzzle every mapmaker who tries to trace the lines backward. Houses in the wrong place, that's what the curious call them now. Half-rotted outlines in mossy clearings, log walls squared off, where they shouldn't be foundations, whispering of shapes that belong to someone else's blueprints. Tonight, you push through brambles that snag your sleeves and find yourself standing where the forest parts around an odd rise of earth. Stones mark out a rectangle longer than any sweat lodge or roundhouse nearby. The logs collapsed into damp mounds, once locked together in tight corners. Corners sharper than the soft curves favored by the local builders. If you squint through the dusk, you can almost see beams arching overhead, planks chiseled to fit so snugly they shed wind like a ship's hull turned inside out. It's these details that pull historians in, like moths to a smoky lantern. Some believe these strange homesteads mark the footprints of Norse settlers who tried to build halls in the hush of unfamiliar woods. Maybe they lasted a winter or two, long enough to fell trees. Hammer pegs teach a local or two how to split logs their way. Maybe they left in spring when supplies thinned and stories thickened, stories of storm, sour soil, or feuds with neighbors who preferred their forests quiet. Not everyone agrees, of course. Some scholars remain convinced that what looks like a Viking hall could just as easily be a native experiment. Local builders, trying out new methods learned from a wandering trader, or reimagining a lodge after hearing ship stories by firelight. Oral tales hint at both truth strangers, with iron axes teaching new cuts, then vanishing like mist when the snow came heavy. You step over a moss-slick threshold, real or imagined. Inside the forest, hush swallows you whole. Sunlight drips through a broken roof beam that no longer holds the rain at bay. Small animals have made their claim here, now nesting in corners, where once, perhaps, a Norseman unrolled furs, stared at unfamiliar stars, and wondered how far he was from home. Earlier, you held a bead that crossed continents on a whisper of trade. Now you stand where walls once stood, heavy timbers that speak a language of angles, joinery, and stubborn persistence. No driftwood here, these logs were felled-shaped, not washed up by chance. And each squared beam hums with the effort of men whose axes bit deeper than any local flint blade could match. One curious fact, some foundations uncovered far north bear unmistakable marks of Norse building techniques, corner notches, iron spikes, pegs, rather than rawhide lashings. Yet no clear record ties them to an official voyage. Are they the footprints of outlaws' runaways, or quiet traders turned settlers who thought they could make a home where their ships could not follow? As you imagine these ghosts, a soft rustle pulls your eye to the doorway. A child stands there, just a shape in the dusk, watching you watch the past. Maybe he's the son of a craftsman who found iron nails on the shore, or maybe he's part of the local clan, peering into what the elders say is no place for stories to root too deep. He steps inside, runs a palm along a rotting beam, feeling for secrets that no elder will speak aloud. The boy turns, catches your gaze, then slips back into the trees, taking your questions with him. Some stories the forest keeps for itself. You stand alone in the quiet ruin, listening for the hammer's echo that will never come. Outside, moss creeps over squared logs. Roots push through rotting planks, splitting them back to soil, one patient inch at a time. In the end, every hall becomes forest again, walls bending into bramble floors, sinking to leaf mold and mushroom caps. Yet something lingers in the hush. A shape that shouldn't be here, a method passed hand to hand, a stubborn piece of another world wedged into the green hush. And like the beads and the nails, these logs whisper, drift far enough, build wide enough, and even the wrong place might hold you, if only for one winter's worth of tales. Step beyond the last moss-covered log, and you find yourself on a narrow footpath, trodden more by stories than by feet. The wind here carries something older than campfire smoke, a rumor that drifts like mist through family lines, tangled in the roots of names that don't always belong. Marriage or myth? That's the question elders and genealogists whisper about when the night grows quiet and someone dares to claim a bit of Norse blood in their veins. Picture a small settlement tucked where the river bends gentle and wide. In one corner stands a family lodge, its roof patched with birch bark and memories. Inside, a woman plats her daughter's hair, weaving in beads that shimmer like those traded from distant coasts. She hums an old tune, one she claims was taught by a grandmother who spoke words that no other clan remembers. A word for snow that sounds more like Iceland than inland forest. A word for boat that echoes like a wave hitting the prow of a ship long vanished. Outside, a hunter returns from the marsh, with geese slung over his shoulder. He swears his father's father's father was tall and fair-haired, with eyes the color of iron nails left too long in salt air. He tells this story as if it's fact, but when the children ask for proof, he shrugs. The proof is in the height of his cousins, he jokes, or the way the family's hair holds a stubborn copper shine under winter sun. Somewhere, in the hush of scholarly debate, a few historians sift through these tangled roots. Parish records and baptism names where they exist offer only hints. Many were never written down, or if they were, they lie buried beneath new alphabets and burned mission schools. The families keep their versions alive in lullabies, in the shape of cheekbones and jokes about boats and cold seas, and old promises whispered under pine boughs. Some scholars insist these stories are just that, stories. Folklore thick with wishful thinking, sewn together from stray beads carved beams and a taste for making oneself the child of adventure. They say bloodlines bend easier than timbers reshaped to claim kin with ghost ships no living witness ever saw. But others pause when they hear the same names echo far from the coast, old Norse names twisted into new shapes by tongues unused to rolled R's and soft consonants. Imagine sitting by that family lodge as winter presses its white hand against the windows. Inside, 3 generations gather around a pot of stew, steam rising like questions too polite to ask outright. The eldest hums a song that might once have sailed from a fjord, though its verses have grown mossy with time. The youngest stares into the steam, listening for words he half understands but feels in his bones. Earlier, you traced iron through arrowheads, beads through forest trails, houses through moss. Now you run your finger along the unseen lines of family trees. Branches that split rejoin and sometimes vanish altogether. Somewhere in those crooked limbs, a single Norse heart might beat untested by any DNA kit, invisible to any paper record, but alive in a child's stubborn nose, or the way someone hums when they're alone. One curious fact: in scattered corners of the North, a handful of families still gather once a year to retell these claims. A wedding toast includes a line about ancestors who came in dragon-headed ships. A funeral prayer mentions a long-lost coast no map dares mark. Scholars listen at the edges, scribbling notes, debating whether these are echoes of truth or the warm comfort of a good story that makes winter nights feel less lonely. You watch the woman finish her daughter's braid, tie it off with a bit of copper wire saved from a trader's pouch. She pats the girl's shoulder and turns to the fire where the hunter leans, carving a new bow with iron tools his own grandfather might have traded for bear hides. He glances up at you as if he knows you're listening in on his family's secrets. He says nothing, of course. Some things belong to blood, alone claimed or invented real, or only real when spoken aloud under winter stars. You step back into the hush carrying the rumor with you. A rumor of marriages unmarked by parchment, of lineages that drift through memory like longboats in fog. And whether myth or marrow, the tale persists, tucked into lullabies, stitched into birth names, and whispered into the hush when the snow falls thick enough to cover even the deepest footprints. Beyond the hush of family fires and tangled names, you follow a trail that leads deeper into the frost-bitten north, a trail rumored to echo with the soft crunch of hidden footsteps and the soft barter of bear hides traded under moonlit pines. They call them the bearskin traders' strangers, who slipped through the forest shadows, fur-wrapped figures who spoke in half-known words and offered iron where bone once ruled. Picture a small clearing where the snow packs down under cautious boots. A trader stands near his canoe, its belly stuffed with bear pelts so thick they steam faintly in the cold. Across from him waits a local hunter, his breath pluming as he fingers the edge of a steel knife, another gift from traders who arrived without fanfare and left with their secrets intact. Between them lies a single fire burning low, as if afraid to draw too much attention to this quiet exchange. Some say these traders were Norse men who drifted farther than their sagas admit outlaws' exiles, or just bold enough to try their luck where the old maps went blank. No longboats here, no dragonheads carving through the fog. Only canoes, borrowed traps, laid pelts gathered where the bear's winter den meets the river's frozen edge. They came not as raiders, but as merchants, their axes and bear hides moving silently between camps where furs meant warmth and survival, and iron meant sharper edges for the hunt. You stand at the edge of the clearing, half hidden among spruce boughs heavy with frost. You watch the exchange, one pelt for 2 knives, or a ring of copper for traps and salt. Neither man speaks much. Words are too heavy here, and trust rides on silence and the flicker of the flame between them. Oral stories whisper about these shadow traders, men with strange beards who never stayed long enough for names to stick, but left behind tools that outlasted their footprints. Some elders say they married into local clans, slipping into family lines like cold rivers under ice, never claiming more than a child here, a rumor there. Others swear they were ghosts, wanderers so pale they seemed made of snow, appearing when the bears grew fat and the nights grew longest. Historians still debate whether these fur whispers mark real Norse traders or just the forest's way of weaving myth from footprints and claw marks. There's little to prove beyond a chisel here, a scrap of iron there, buried deep in tundra that gives up its secrets as slowly as a bear waking from sleep. Earlier, you stood inside the strange houses, left half swallowed by moss. Now, you peer over a flickering fire at a trade as old as hunger fur for metal warmth for edge. The hunter reaches for another pelt, thick with the musk of deep forest dens. He tests the iron blade again, eyes flicking to the trader's pale face, wondering where he comes from, where he'll go when the thaw turns the river back to restless water. There's a moment, a hush even deeper than the snow, when the wind rattles dry birch branches, and both men pause to listen. Perhaps they're listening for wolves. Perhaps they're listening for the echo of voices from a carved hall half a world away. Or perhaps they're listening for the forest's permission, its reluctant blessing for strangers to share warmth without shedding blood. A curious fact, some trading posts built centuries later sit right where these quiet exchanges are rumored to have flickered first. Under the planks of forts and mission houses, archaeologists sometimes find older iron scraps that match no local forges, small hints that someone here once carried metal north when maps still called it the unknown. When the trade is done, the hunter lifts the fresh knife, turning its edge toward the starlight. He slips it into his belt beside the flint it will soon replace. The trader shoulders his pack gestures once in what might be thanks or farewell and melts back into the trees, a moving shadow that will leave no trail come dawn. The fire flickers low, then out, as if to erase the proof that men once bartered secrets here beneath the hush of bare breath and frost. You step closer, towing the ashes. Nothing remains but a faint warmth, a soft indent in snow where pelts once lay, a promise that even in the loneliest places, the world finds ways to meet quietly in the hush between claw marks and the long, soft scrape of steel on hide. Long after the traders vanish back into frost, and rumor you follow the trail north, where wind carves rock bare and time leaves its fingerprints for the patient to find. Here among lichen-covered stones and frost-scarred boulders, strange markings wait runes on the stones, silent scratches that spark arguments like dry moss catching flame. Picture a lonely outcrop above a frozen river bend. Snow drifts gather in the crevices, but just beneath the crust of ice and moss, a line of symbols slants across the rock's weathered face. Some say these runes are proof carved by Norse hands to mark a place, claim a moment when the world's edges blurred, and a longboat's prow brushed against the unknown. Others scoff, calling them clever fakes, scribbles cut by later hands, hungry for a legend, or natural cracks mistaken for ancient code. Tonight, you stand in the hush of snow and wind your breath, the only sound as you kneel to trace those lines with a gloved finger. The stone bites cold through your palm, but the markings burn warm in the mind. They bend and loop crisp where the blade bit deepest, faint where wind and water wore them down. You imagine the man who carved them may be an outlaw sailor, far from home, leaving his name behind like a stubborn echo. Maybe a storyteller who knew that a good tale needs an anchor, and a few scratches on a stone would outlast any voice. The local hunters pass by these stones on their way to set traps. Some pause to touch the runes, spitting a small prayer to keep the trickster spirits at bay. Others ignore them entirely, shrugging off the white man's puzzle with a laugh that rolls off into the pines. They know the land remembers in its own way, and what matters is what feeds the fire, not what scratches at rock under old snow. Some historians claim these runes match the style found carved on burial stones in faraway fjords, curves and lines that once named kings' raiders or saints now stranded in a place no saga mentions. A handful of scholars remain convinced the runes are real cold proof that iron prows nosed up muddy rivers long before Columbus scribbled at the edge of his maps. Others with equal passion call them a hoax, a prank to lure tourists or stir up grant money, or just a boy's knife idle in the hand while he waited for the fish to bite. Earlier, you crouched by a hidden trade fire, watching fur and iron change hands in the hush of pine boughs. Now you kneel beside a stone that might have heard those same voices drift through the dark. Wind rattles the branches overhead, flinging tiny needles across the snow. The runes wait. They don't care if you believe them or not. They will outlast your breath and the footprints you leave behind when you stand. A curious twist, sometimes new markings appear. Fresh cuts mimicking the old tempting, the hopeful to believe that secrets multiply on the stone like frost patterns overnight. Archaeologists visit, measure, argue, scratch their heads. The local kids smirk behind mittened hands, swapping bets on who has the sharpest blade and the steadiest wrist. Myth meets mischief here as it always has. You stand brushing snow from your knees. The runes stare back silent witnesses or clever lies no more willing to explain themselves than the ghosts of carved longboats drifting under a blood moon. Somewhere deep in the hush, you imagine the sound of steel biting stone, a quick scratch, a glance over the shoulder, the distant hush of waves or wolves. When you leave the outcrop, the wind smooths your footprints, just as it did for whoever knelt here last. The stone stays. The runes linger, waiting for another curious finger, another voice to wonder out loud whether a long-forgotten sailor squatted here cold and lonely and decided to carve his name into forever. You step back onto the trail. The river below murmurs beneath its crust of ice, carrying old secrets under the snow. Somewhere down that river, another stone might wait, another mark, another riddle. Or maybe just smooth rock, and the echo of your own questions following you home through the hush. Follow the river north, where the forest thins into open tundra, and the wind has no trees to tangle its breath. Here, the ground hides things. The old tales barely mention strange iron tools buried deep beneath permafrost and lichen. Tools in the tundra, small scraps of stubborn evidence that someone worked iron where no known Norse hall ever stood. Imagine standing alone in this wide, white hush. The air snaps at your cheeks, the snow squeaks under your boots. A trapper bends over a patch of frost-burned earth, brushing aside moss to reveal a shard of iron. Maybe it's a chisel, its edge dulled by centuries of cold. Maybe a rivet once part of something larger, an axe, a spear, a ship that never made it back to salt water. Archaeologists argue endlessly about these bits of metal. Some swear they belong to later traders, French voyageurs, Hudson's Bay men, early missionaries, who lugged iron with them, like breadcrumbs, through the north. But others point out that a handful of these finds lie too far from known roots, too old by carbon's whisper to fit the neat timeline of trade forts and powder kegs. The debate hangs in the frozen air. each scrap of iron another spark for old scholars to warm their hands over. You kneel beside the trapper as he lifts the chisel to the pale sun. Rust flakes into the wind. It's not much to look at, just a tool simple and blunt, with no markings to brag where it came from or who lost it here. Yet it hums with possibility. Was it dropped by a Norse scout trekking inland for furs or game when the coast grew hungry? Or did it ride hidden in a trader's bag centuries later, lost during a hurried portage or a winter camp abandoned when the caribou never came? Earlier, you traced runes on lonely stones. Now, your fingertips brush a relic no rune master signed silent and practical, its only story, the fact that it shouldn't be here at all. There's no carved dragon head to claim it, no saga to sing its origin. Just iron and tundra frost and doubt. A curious fact, some local elders tell stories that echo older than the written record rumors of strangers who carried strange tools north when the caribou herds shifted and the winter sun dipped too soon. Some describe men with pale hair and hard axes carving shelters from drift logs, vanishing before the snowmelt could pin them down. These whispers don't live in books. They flicker in winter stories told when the oil lamp burns low and the wind rattles bone against bone. You follow the trapper as he tucks the chisel into a hide satchel, already heavy with mink and fox. He's not thinking about Norse footprints or sagas turned to rust. He thinks about the next trap line, the warmth of the cabin, the taste of tea thick with pine smoke. But when asked, he shrugs, says he's found stranger things out here than bits of iron. Fossil bones, old coins, beads that match none he's seen in trade packs today. Standing in this wide white nowhere, you sense the iron hum beneath your boots, scattered hints that drifted far beyond the edge of the known world. Tools in the tundra speak more softly than runes or beads. They don't claim a camp or a hall. They just lie in wait, seeds of doubt and wonder frozen in moss and frost. A gust rattles the low scrub willow as you turn back toward the river. Somewhere beneath the snow, other chisels, rivets, or iron nails may sleep a scattered legacy of hands that shaped wood and hide in a place too far from sagas to matter to kings. But here tonight, under the drifting hush, they matter to you. Because iron is stubborn. It doesn't vanish with rumor or myth. It rusts, sinks, and waits until someone kneels in the hush, brushes aside moss with half-frozen fingers, and wonders for just a heartbeat how far a longboat could sail when no one was looking. When the tundra hush turns to coastal mist again, you find yourself walking along pebbled beaches where driftwood collects in bleached piles and sea fog turns the world into a memory. Here, among gull cries and salt tang old stories, stirred dreams of the longboat, they call them. Visions that come not to scholars or traders, but to those who keep their ears tuned to the wind and their eyes half shut at dawn. Imagine standing at the water's edge, the tide whispering against your boots. The morning mist curls low, thick enough to hide seals or something larger. An elder beside you lifts a hand, pointing silently toward a shape that slides between the swells, too narrow to be a rock, too long to be a whale. The shape glides on trailing silence in its wake. You blink, and it's gone, swallowed by fog as easily as a dream at waking. Some call them ghost ships, longboats that never quite reach shore, doomed to drift in the borderland between past and present. Others insist these visions are memories passed down in blood surfacing when sea and mind grow quiet enough. Stories say The boats come at dawn when the world softens at its edges, and even doubters can see a dragon head carved from old timber part the mist. Earlier you touched iron chisels left miles from any known camp. Now you watch for ships that may never have landed at all. The people who speak of them do so softly around driftwood fires, eyes half on the surf. Children listen wide-eyed breath, held because the tale carries both warning and wonder. See them, and you remember the coast has always belonged to more than one kind of traveler. Historians remain divided. Some say such tales are just what the mind makes when staring too long into fog shapes born of fear, longing, or the sea's endless hunger. Others argue the persistence of these stories scattered along thousands of miles of shoreline hints at something real. A fleeting contact, longboats that slipped ashore, traded quietly, and departed before scribes could catch their names. A curious twist in some coastal dialects, words for certain boats bend oddly toward Norse roots. A syllable here, a consonant there, like driftwood words washed ashore and smoothed by retelling. No scroll or rune explains how they arrived, but they linger stubborn as barnacles. You walk a little further along the tide line, pebbles crunching underfoot. A raven calls from the bluff above as if mocking your search. Ahead, a pile of driftwood catches your eye. Long logs, bleached bone white, stacked by tide and storm. You pause, squinting, and for a breathless instant, they look like a hull's ribs. The suggestion of a deck, a carved prow. Then the next wave, breaks salt spray, stings your eyes, and the shape dissolves back into tangle and tide. An elder once told a visiting trader that the longboats never truly left. They learned to drift between the mists, appearing only when the watcher is part awake, part dreaming. Some claim that in these moments you glimpse a truth too wide to fit in chronicles, that not every voyage ended in settlement, not every prow carried conquest. Some simply watched the shore, left a nail or a bead behind, and vanished back into story. At night, around the fire, you see those dragon-headed ships, again painted in words across smoke and shadow. Children cling to their parents' sleeves, asking what the men on board wanted, what language they spoke, why they left no houses or graves. No one answers with certainty. The sea keeps its own counsel. You turn back from the water breath, clouding in the cold air. The tide pulls foam across pebbles in soft sighs, as though retelling old arrivals and older departures. The longboats, real or imagined, remain adrift in the hush between surf and sky, always almost seen. And whether they were dreams or ships carved from memory and mist, they remain part of this coast's heartbeat. A reminder that even when the last sail rots, the story sails on riding fog banks and the restless hush of tide. The tide recedes, leaving behind wet sand and half-buried driftwood, as if the longboats themselves stepped ashore for a moment, then slipped back beneath the surf. But even when the fog lifts and no carved prows glide through the breakers, the stories drift inland, carried by tongues, around campfires and lullabies that flicker like sparks on the coldest nights. Stray sagas pass down broken fragments of Norse tales that found a second home far from the fjords. Imagine a winter lodge deep inland, its log walls chinked with moss, a small fire snapping as children lean close to hear a story they've half heard before. An elder, his voice rough as bark, speaks of a hero who wrestled a bear, or a sea king who rode storms instead of fleeing them. Sometimes the names twist through generations. Thor becomes something softer, a storm spirit who pounds on the roof when snow blows sideways. Odin slips into a shape, the children understand a one-eyed wanderer who drifts through camps testing generosity by begging for scraps. Some scholars puzzle over these stray sagas, bits of Norse myth that appear in places no Viking ship was supposed to reach. How does a god with a hammer echo in stories told by hunters who never knew the word fjord? Did they come tucked into trade talk, drifting alongside beads and iron, or did they slip ashore with sailors too restless to stay put? The debates roll on like thaw rivers, half frozen, always moving, never clear, ever. Earlier, you squinted at runes carved on stone, messages or mischief. Now, you sit inside this lodge, where words swirl like wood smoke, half-remembered verses that mix with local spirits, wolves that speak riddles, bears that carry human souls, storms that know your name. These sagas do not stay pure. They merge, bend, grow fur, and antlers change accents. By the time they slip into a bedtime chant, they are part Norse, part something older, part something new. One curious thing, in some communities far inland, children's games include phrases that echo old Norse curses or charms. Elders brush them off as nonsense, but linguists catch syllables that taste of brine and pine needles, words too stubborn to melt, even when centuries wash over them. Maybe it's just coincidence. Or maybe stories like iron nails drift farther than any map can chart. Tonight, you watch as the children giggle when the elder raises his arms to mimic the roar of a storm giant. They squeal when he stomps the floor, rattling the rafters just enough to chase away the night's deeper hush. For a heartbeat, you can almost see a longboat riding the waves outside, oars dipping in rhythm with the old man's chant. Then the laughter fades back to fire crackle and the drip of melting snow at the door. Outside, the forest listens. The wind tugs at the lodge's smoke hole, spinning a coil of ash up to the stars. Somewhere beyond the pines, a wolf howls a sound so old it doesn't care what language wraps around it. Stories slip from tongue to tongue, generation to generation, the same way traders once slipped beads into calloused hands under spruce boughs. Historians still argue whether these stray sagas prove anything. Some say they are proof of nothing, just human minds, hungry for magic, willing to borrow any god who can keep a child quiet through the long dark. Others smile at the pattern, how similar images serpents that circle the world. Wise ravens thunder that talks, drift across continents like seeds in a restless wind. You lean closer to the fire. Sparks dance across the elder's lined face as he pauses, looking at the smallest child curled in his mother's lap. He speaks one last line, half threat, half promise, about the hero returning when the ice cracks open come spring. The child shivers, hiding her face in the fur collar at her mother's shoulder. But tomorrow, she'll repeat the tale to her brother, adding her own twist, carving a new mark on an old driftwood story. The lodge grows quiet again. Outside, snow hushes the trees, covering tracks, smoothing paths. But inside, the sagas whisper on fragments of carved prow dreams and thunder god boasts stitched into lullabies and hunting chants, reminders that the world is wide and stories drift farther than ships ever do. Long after the embers die down inside that winter lodge, you find yourself wandering deeper into the hush where myth and memory braid themselves into something new. Here, under the sway of snow-heavy pines and the slow swirl of northern lights, old legends reshape themselves into guardians and ghosts. Spirit of the Northmen, they call him now. Neither Viking nor villager, but something in between, a figure forged from scraps of iron stray sagas and the hush of drifting snow. Imagine a lone hunter stepping out before dawn, frost clinging to the fur fringe of his hood. He lifts his eyes to the wavering green river overhead and mutters a short prayer, not to the spirits of elk or bear, but to a ghost warrior whose name no longer fits any scroll. They say this spirit taught the first hunters to cut new trails through the frozen marsh, to trust iron over bone, to stand their ground when wolves circled the camp in the blue hour before sunrise. Some elders speak of him as a whispering shadow, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs, stitched with copper beads that catch moonlight. He carries an axe that never dulls and a voice that rolls like distant surf. When storms pin a hunting party too far from the hearth, they swear they feel his shape moving in the blizzard, stamping out a rough circle in the snow, so no man wakes up buried. Or so the tales go. Scholars wrinkle their brows at such stories. They note the uncanny echoes how these tales of a wandering ironclad figure mirror Norse warriors who once braved the North Sea's shrieking winds. The parallels curl like smoke, the tall silhouette, the fur cloaks the iron blade that cuts what bone cannot. Some argue it's only natural when new tools come, new stories must follow, clothed in shapes familiar enough to fit the old fears and hopes. Earlier, you heard stray sagas slip from one tongue to another, drifting like smoke across generations. Now, you stand in the hush of spruce and drifted snow, sensing how these tales turn tools into omens, nails into totems, traitors into phantoms. The spirit of the Northmen is not a name found in Norse runes or sagas, yet he lingers in these woods more stubbornly than any chisel buried in tundra. There's a curious fact tucked in here. In some remote villages, hunters still carve small talismans, bits of drift iron bent into crude axes, tiny boats shaped from bone and soot. These charms hang from lodge rafters or ride in leather pouches, rattling softly beside dried herbs and scraps of flint. Ask where they come from, and the answer is always the same. From him, the one who taught us to carve trails in snow, too deep for old feet to break. You push on through the hush, your breath turning white in the cold. Ahead, you find an old circle of stones, half buried in drift. Someone once built a fire here, or maybe many fires over many winters. The ground feels heavy with memories. For a heartbeat, the air tastes of wood smoke and salted meat, a campsite where hunters spoke of a figure who watched from the tree line, neither friend nor foe, but kin, in the raw logic of snow and steel. When the northern wind picks up, you hear the echo of footsteps pacing the shadows. A cloak rustles, iron clinks at a belt. Of course, when you blink, it's only the trees creaking, the wind rattling ice crusts from bare branches. But the story stays behind your eyes, a reminder that the spirit of the Northman lives in the hush between waking and sleep, between fact and the soft drift of whispered legend. Back at the lodge, children roll up in furs to chase away the draft. They dream of snow warriors stepping through blizzards, guiding lost travelers home with a silent nod and the promise of warmth. Parents smile at the tales, practical enough to scare kids into respecting the cold, comforting enough to promise that the woods watch out for their own. Scholars keep scribbling notes and footnotes tracing the legend through language roots and artifacts half buried under lichen. But here tonight, you sense that the truth doesn't lie in what can be proved or polished for museum glass. It lives in breath that fogs up the dusk and tracks that vanish at dawn, and in the soft promise that sometimes the forest walks with you. So you stand still as the wind weaves through the spruce, carrying the iron taste of old tools, the flicker of ghost fires, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a myth made flesh in drifting snow. As the northern lights fade into a deep, dark hush, you follow the faint trail, deeper still, past stories carved on stones, iron tools hidden in frost, and ghost warriors who wander between campfires and dreams. Here, the old path falters, swallowed by pine roots and centuries of silence. When the tracks end, you stand on the last footprint, where legend turns back into forest hush, leaving behind only questions soft as falling snow. Picture this. A lone ridge rises above a valley misted with dawn frost. A narrow footpath curls along its spine, marked here and there by half-buried stones, a broken length of log, the ghost outline of what might have been a wall. You kneel brushing away pine needles, hoping to find another clue. A scrap of iron, a faint rune, the outline of a fire pit that might say, yes, they stood here too. But the earth shrugs and offers nothing more than soil and moss. Some scholars swear that these missing footprints prove the Norse gave up turning their carved prows back toward the stormy sea when the winters bit too hard and neighbors grew less willing to trade. Others claim the footprints never really ended, just changed shape, blending into local trails until iron nails and wooden halls dissolved into bone tips and stories by firelight. Earlier, you watched the spirit of the Northman slip through snow-laden branches, a ghost that might be iron trader outlaw or dream. Now you stand at the edge of what remains a clearing half-eaten by young birches, the only sign of a settlement lost to time. You press your palm into the cold ground, feeling for the pulse of old footsteps. There is none, just the soft thud of your own heartbeat and the faint whisper of wind through last year's dry grass. One curious fact: historians found a single iron rivet here, rusted to a pitted nub. Too small to prove a hall, ever stood too solid to dismiss. A fragment tucked into a museum drawer, somewhere labeled with polite uncertainty, possible Norse origin. Possible. A word that floats like mist when certainty can't root itself in the dirt. Somewhere beyond this clearing, the forest thickens again, a tangle of spruce and cedar that swallows sound as surely as it swallows footsteps. You imagine a trader slipping through that hush centuries ago, tools rattling in a fur pack, a long knife strapped tight at his waist. Maybe he turned back to glance at this clearing one last time before the path vanished behind him. Maybe he hummed a song that no one else would ever hear. Back then he didn't know he was laying down a trail for the curious. He only knew the snow fell deeper than his boots could handle, that the bear meat smoked by the fire wouldn't last through spring, that the neighbors watched with eyes half shut and hands too close to spears. So he turned, stepped into the trees, and the trail ended not in war or glory, but in silence. Not every saga needs a battle to disappear. Tonight, you trace that same quiet ending. There is no signpost here, no rune that says where the longboats turn to rumor. Just the hush of early dawn, the soft drip of thawing snow. From low branches, the crunch of your own boots in last year's fallen needles. You stand alone in a place that used to hold a story, and maybe still does, if you lean close enough to hear it breathing. One more truth. Local elders say the land remembers what the foot forgets. That roots swallow timbers, frost cracks, stone, but the hush holds echoes if you listen. Some families pass down stories of hunters who stumbled onto old iron hidden in tree hollows or buried under fire pits where no forge should stand. Others claim they heard voices, strangers speaking in rough syllables, laughing in the fog, long after the last nailed plank vanished beneath moss. You step back from the clearing, glancing over your shoulder at the shape of what might have been a hall or a house or a dream. The wind tugs at your collar, nudging you onward. The path ends here, but the story doesn't. It drifts on your breath, tucked behind your ribs, like a stray nail you forgot in your pocket. When the tracks end, legend begins. A hush that promises more questions than answers, and maybe that's how it should be. Some stories are better left half buried, waiting for the next curious soul to kneel in the dirt and wonder where all the footsteps went. When the path vanishes into pine needles and the footprints melt into hush, you find yourself standing at the edge of a memory that never really left. Lingering echoes the elders call them soft reminders that history never fades so cleanly as a broken trail or a lost rivet in museum glass. It hums on in places where driftwood meets the tide, where a single word hides in a lullaby, where a child fingers a bead that shouldn't be here at all. Picture this final scene, a small coastal village perched above a bay that smells of salt and spruce. Morning mist clings to cedar roofs as elders gather near a driftwood fire, their breath mingling with wood smoke in the cold dawn. Children hover at their knees, half listening, half dreaming. One elder taps a stick against the ashes, tracing shapes. Only he can see ships with dragon heads, iron nails scattered in sand runes, curling around stones like frost. He doesn't call it proof. He calls it a reminder. The old ones say the past is never truly gone, just sleeping under the skin of the land, waiting for the right ears to wake it up again. Every once in a while, the ocean coughs up something. A carved plank, a copper ring, dulled by centuries of salt. Some trader finds it tangled in kelp, or a child picks it up, turns it over in small hands, asks, "What's this?" Scholars argue over these scraps. Some say they're drift wreckage of ships long forgotten by any saga or scribe. Others lean closer, tracing old trade routes on maps, guessing how far an iron rivet might travel, tucked inside a fur pack, or sewn into the hem of a trader's coat. But out here far from lecture halls and glass cases, the people watching the tide know it differently. They know the story never ends, where the records stop. It just hums quieter. Earlier, you stood where runes whisper from stone, where tools hide in tundra, where ghost longboats drift through fog, so thick they might just be the edge of your own breath. Now you sit among the last echo stories that drift from lip to lip, carried on the hush of firewood crackling at the edge of sleep. A curious fact, in some places, elders still mark the beach each spring, stacking driftwood into piles that echo the shape of ships. Children run circles around them, shrieking laughter that lifts old spirits from their slumber. They say it's just a game, a way to use what the ocean brings. But the shape stays the same, long and narrow, with a prow that curves up as if sniffing out the next shore. Somewhere behind you, the ocean breathes against the rocks, steady, relentless, the oldest storyteller of all. It buries what it wants, reveals what it chooses. And if you listen close enough, you might hear the hush of oars dipping in time, with your pulse a soft creak of timbers that no longer exist except here in the hush behind your ribs. One elder finishes his tracing in the ashes, wipes his hand clean on his worn deerskin cloak, and looks up at the children. He doesn't say Viking or Norse. He doesn't say artifact or evidence. He just says, "Listen." And in that single word is the truth, buried deeper than any rune. The stories linger because we let them. Some say the iron nails rusted to nothing, that the beads were traded inland until they vanished in river silt, that the last ghost ship slipped under a wave no one saw. Maybe that's true. But here tonight, you sense what the elders know. Nothing really leaves. Not if someone remembers to whisper it by firelight. You stand up, brushing sand from your palms, the hush of the tide curling around your ankles. Somewhere behind your closed eyes, a longboat drifts through mist iron nails, glinting in the dawn hush. You open your eyes. There's only driftwood and gull cries. But the story is still there, stitched into salt air, and the slow breath of waves against stone. In the end, the echoes keep you company. And maybe that's enough. Because as long as someone asks, what's this history never really leaves? It drifts just out of reach, waiting for curious hands to find it again in the hush of tomorrow's tide. So here you are standing at the end of a trail that never truly ends, where iron nails rust quietly under moss, runes fade beneath lichen, and ghost ships ride the fog in the soft hush before dawn. Maybe you came searching for proof, for a line that pins myth to fact, like a rivet to a timber beam. Or maybe, like the elders by the driftwood fire, you came to listen for the echo that hums between the waves and the wind. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the salt air on your cheek, the hush of waves carrying secrets only the restless ocean keeps. Somewhere out there, a carved prow drifts on the tide of your thoughts, neither here nor gone, just waiting in the fog, like an old question you can carry with you into sleep. The fire has burned low now. Stories circle in the embers, iron beads buried far inland. Pale strangers who traded bear pelts beneath silent pines, soft syllables of old words tucked inside lullabies. A gentle reminder that history is not a closed book, but a quiet shoreline. Each wave, a whisper, each footprint, another tale waiting to be found. So breathe deep. Let the hush wrap around you like a fur cloak against the northern wind. Maybe you'll dream of ships gliding through dawn mist, or maybe you'll dream of a single nail found in driftwood, still carrying the salt of a voyage half remembered. Either way, the story drifts with you, now lingering like echoes do, until you're ready to listen again.